Welcome to the Drury podcast. Thanks for joining me. I've been working in the manufacturing industry now for nearly 30 years and have met many interesting and influential people along the way. This podcast is only made possible through the support of Manufacturing Skills Australia. However, the views and the conversations are not representative of the organisation. They are mine alone. I hope that you enjoy this conversation and will like, subscribe and share with those people who you think may be interested. Thanks for doing this, I really appreciate it.
No, that's okay.
And one of the other reasons we really wanted to have you on was because it's been majorly male dominated, as manufacturing broadly is.
Oh, okay.
So it's trying to even the score a little bit. And
yes.
I know there's plenty of really good and influential women who are in manufacturing, and the textiles industry is an interesting one for me, as you know, as
Yep.
the chair of this IRC for the last few years. That's been a female-dominated industry in the design space and that sort of area. So for me, it's good to at last get someone from textiles. So just to start off, if you can just say who you are and
Okay.
what you do.
Sure. My name's Meriel Chamberlin. I'm a textile scientist. What I now do is have a business called Circle Fibres, and that's basically set up because it occurred to me after years in supply chain that I wanted to know where my things were from, how they were made and where they were going, and wanted to know exactly that, not just hope where it was from, hope the audit was right, hope the right thing had been done. And I figured other people might want to do that too. And I started doing it with cotton in Australia because a few people were already doing this with merino, and I love wool and it's fantastic, but I decided to do something that wasn't being done, and so that's where that started from. But to roll back a little, I'm a textile scientist because I just loved messing around with textiles pretty much since I could draw and make things.
Yeah.
And I was fortunate enough to grow up at a time when textile science was a uni degree in the UK. It still is, and also that it was sponsored at the time by retailers and their suppliers, because they wanted people who were managers that could technically understand what's going on in the supply chain in order to be able to manage quality, innovation, all the rest of it, which is really different from today actually. And so I was somebody that was all right at design, but I was good at the maths and science at school, and was given some really good advice that getting the maths and science and the engineering side of it was going to be harder to get later in life compared with the design. And so I studied this amazing degree in Manchester, one of the homes of the textile industry since the Industrial Revolution, where I studied everything about how textiles are made, natural and synthetic, different elements of the mechanical, electrical, chemical engineering, dye chemistry, all of that stuff. And at the end of that, I still loved it. And I'm fortunate that that's the case. So my first job was what I now call the military school of how to buy clothing. I was part of a buying team at Marks and Spencer in London, and worked in sports and swim, and worked on all sorts of performance things for moisture wicking, dealing with chlorine on swimwear because it's basically chemical warfare, and had the opportunity to work directly with DuPont on making Lycra even better for it, things like that, which you don't realise the opportunity you have at the time until you move on. But it really was a privilege to be there, and at that time I was there with people 20 years older than me that had really carved the path of managing textiles with quality. And a lot of Marks and Spencer test methods were actually what morphed into being our ISO standards for quality testing today, things like our colour fastness and shrinkage and all the rest of it. So I guess when I look back, it was a really fortunate time to be in the industry, and at that time a lot of our manufacturing was still in the UK, which meant I got to visit a lot of suppliers, not just garment makers but fabric makers.
Yeah.
Following on from there, because being in a buying team is amazing, but you are really stuck in an office more than in a factory. I took an opportunity to work with WL Gore and Associates that make Gore-Tex, and that was in Scotland, and I was part of a technologist for a manufacturing plant there where we laminated that fabric, and that again was an amazing opportunity with another company that was really quality and due diligence led. So I was there for 2 years, and worked on the fabrics that we then used to laminate them to. And again, all of that around, you know, can you make it consistently and all the rest of it. There's one thing to sample a fabric, it's another thing to make 50,000 meters exactly the same.
Yeah.
And it's all those systems and processes actually that I sort of cut my teeth learning in those first 2 jobs, which you don't get to do if you're not operating at that scale. And our customer base was everything from Prada through to the military, and both have their exacting standards in different ways. And worked with amazing people as well, brilliant process engineers and people that really cared about working well, delivering good products and all the rest of it, which again is something that's actually a lot harder to come by now because of the crazy rush of the industry that felt rushed then, even though it was relatively steady paced compared with now. And then what brought me to Australia? I married an Aussie. That's that simple, really. And moved to Brisbane, centre of the textile universe. Not. And that's actually though where I got my opportunity to understand the shape and size of the Australian industry. I still wanted to work in textiles, and worked for Bone, so an iconic Australian brand. And I was with them working on garments that complemented the traditional oilskin range that's made here. And so I actually used to travel to China to visit factories that made shirts and pants and those parts of the range that complemented the traditional items, and dealt with everything then. So working with a smaller business, I, instead of just being responsible for the technical, where you could just list off how many tests you wanted completed and just, you know, go down those rabbit holes, when you're working, I was covering a lot more, everything but the design. So price negotiations, forex, shipping, size ratios, all that kind of thing, as well as the pre-production, quality and bulk production. Also just that appreciation of what goes on in a small or medium business around all of the decisions that really impact cash flow and all of those critical things that come together. So that was where I really got my ground in how everything relates, rather than being just a specialist in a deep technical area. And so that was really my grounding here. And then having children and being a production manager don't generally mix. It's part-time production management doesn't really work. And I was really fortunate to get some project work with what was then TFIA, now Australian Fashion Council, and got to meet lots of Australian manufacturers. And I've always loved being in factories, and that hasn't changed. And I've always been passionate about the ethics and sustainability of manufacturing, and in my world it's textiles. And so getting to meet and realise how much capability is here was a real, again, a privilege. I always consider it a privilege to visit a factory. But to get to know some of the businesses here and sort of become a bit of an advocate and very passionate about the fact that manufacturing's a muscle, you know, use it or lose it. And the businesses that are still here, they're here because they've been agile, they're here because they've been resilient, they're here because they've coped with so much change, which mean, and it now actually means that a lot of the strengths that the businesses that I here have are really different to some of the bigger manufacturers overseas, because they process all sorts of different products. They've actually got really versatile technical skills that aren't always easy to come by in some nations where we assume everything's done better. And maybe it is once you're doing it at scale, but the ability to process wool one day and polyester another day and cotton the next day after that is not always the case in some of the bigger factories overseas. So we actually do have some pretty unique bodies of knowledge here, which I'm really happy to tell that story.
Yeah, well, that's great. And it's quite interesting to me, like I said, when I came before, when MSA, Manufacturing Skills Australia, was the Skills Council, I was a participant on the committee that helped direct the design of the training package and the training products. And then when it changed to IBSA and ended up as the chair of the committee, it's always been very enlightening to me to understand the diversity of the textiles industry, how broad it is. And like you said, you know, your main introduction into this industry was through science.
Yes.
And a lot of people who are consumers of textiles don't understand that there's deep and broad science that goes behind a lot of the fabrics that we wear or use in other ways. Yeah,
and it's one of the things that I think has become, it's why the industry is often not being taken seriously. And yet the minute you think about it, imagine a life without them. Band-aids, bandages, towel sheets, like we come unstuck pretty quickly. And that's just off the top of my head. But I think, and I coin this phrase a little, just because the product's soft doesn't mean the engineering is.
Yeah.
And sometimes just because the product's small and maybe low cost in and of itself doesn't mean the science and engineering behind it is, or certainly its consistency. And I think we maybe begin to appreciate that in some plastics that we consume a bit more, but even things like filters, for example, like how many things require filters that need to work in a very specific way, otherwise a machine doesn't work. The machine might be worth millions of dollars, the filter might be worth a few cents, but if it's wrong. And I think it's also then one of the things where our industry sort of gets put into, that's the textile industry, or that's the clothing industry, or that's the fashion industry, and it's being unpicked a little now with the product stewardship scheme in work, and I'm on the technical advisory group for that, is that even though it's a sector that sounds catch-all, it is so complex, even compared with, say, the container schemes we've got working for plastic bottle, our drinks, all of that. Relatively speaking, that's a relatively materially simple sector. Whereas with textiles and then apparel or anything you make from it, it's not just the complexity of how it's been constructed or the mix of materials in something, then it's all the components that we use to put the product together. And so there are all these layers of science and engineering, essentially. It's just somebody who really understands that might have put it together so beautifully that you're happy to wear it to your friend's wedding.
Yeah. Well, I suppose I think women have been probably the major consumers of textiles broadly. That's been my experience. But it's been interesting to me even to visit a factory that manufactures the fabrics that go on soft furnishings.
Yes.
And whether that be something that is woven into a material or printed, or even the different types of textiles. You talk about cotton, and that seems to be a bit of a passion of yours, is natural fibres and cotton.
Yes.
But even you've got a lot of those oil-based fabrics that are out there as well. Can you tell us anything about the science of any of that?
Oh, okay. Well, I guess if you sort of take an example of upholstery, which can actually be woven here in Brisbane at Belgotex, and they're a weaving mill with jacquard looms, so they can weave in patterns. Now they are able to weave all sorts of different fibres depending on the end use. So for example, they could weave fabric that could be good for a hospital curtain or upholstery that's used in aged or healthcare. They can then laminate a layer to that to give it a performance factor that it's not going to wet through if there's a spillage or something like that. They can also add finishes that make it antimicrobial, but equally they weave me my 100% pure cotton canvas. And so one of the things is we've got these different stages of processing, which can be, the weaving loom, if you like. The technology behind that, in a way, hasn't changed a great deal in a very long time. The speed at which they operate, the control systems that we use to operate them have changed. They've got faster. The energy required to drive them has got lower. They've got more efficient. But then what we can choose to do by combining different fibre choices in there really defines whether we're making something that is a discretionary product versus an essential, because the next thing you could put through that weaving loom or something similar, that down at Bruck, for example, in Wangaratta, where they're weaving with the yarns that our structural firefighters wear. So they involve aramid blends and Nomex and things like that, so that you've got these sort of ultimate fire retardant. But the business of the actual technology of the weaving loom hasn't really changed, whether I'm making the canvas for my bag or the cloth that our firefighters' lives depend on. And so one of the things that's really challenging, I think, for people who come to this new, when they think, we just need to make sure we ring fence our capability to keep our firefighters safe. And it's like, well, to create the critical mass of demand to keep the weaving mill busy, you actually need to have product going through in lots of different categories, so that you're not in these peaks and troughs of single item demand. And it also means you develop a knowledge base amongst your technologists and your manufacturing team of being able to process lots of different things. And that's not just agility to respond to markets, but that's actually where the source of innovation comes, because if we tried that there, what if we try that here? And so we often assume all the sort of innovation's got to come from universities, and actually a lot of the amazing problem solving comes from practitioners who understand machines and then go, if that's doing that, if if we tried this, or if we finished it differently, if we changed a setting, or if we changed a gauge, or if we changed a tension, or if we changed something in the dyeing afterwards, could we create a different property in this fabric with the same tools in our toolkit? Maybe, you know, and that's where our sort of industrial and national capability and resilience comes from, is sort of facilitating that space to be ingenious with what's in front of us. And that's the bit that I love most about working with factories and working with people in factories, because you have a conversation with somebody that knows a machine intimately and they go, oh no, but we've tried this. You never know unless you stand in the space with them. And that's where the little nuggets of gold are.
Yeah, well, experience is the mother of invention, isn't it? You know,
something like that. And usually with somebody then asking a question in a different way because they've not come from the same level of experience. And that's what I've really learned with my own business with the cotton, and going, well, what can we do with what's in front of us, as opposed to, can I create this, yes or no? And asking each manufacturer that I work with, well, how is it you work? How is it your batch sizes work? What are the different capabilities your machines have? Oh, okay, so if I'm already doing this, we could do that as well. I could offer that to a customer. But understanding a certain constraints means I won't offer a customer something that can't be done, because I'm like, no, I know they haven't got the processing capability for that. Could we achieve it this way instead? What are you trying to do? And it's that sort of agile, innovative thinking that comes from having an understanding of what is going on in a factory, as opposed to just looking at a range of products that they make.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to me, like I've just done Ironman on the weekend, and there was a few Australian manufacturers and designers of, you know, the specialised textiles that are used in, you know, swimsuits and triathlon suits, and they're having to go offshore to get a lot of these things made, whether it be sewn or the fabric itself, because we don't have a threshold level that could meet that demand in an Australian context.
Yeah, there are a couple of specialists in those sectors, and one of the biggest challenges in Australia isn't capability, it's capacity. So there are places that make triathlon gear here, there are people that can make the specialist stretch textiles, but to my knowledge, everybody that can do that is very, very busy, which means, you know, I'm experiencing that in my own business, just in the basics of access to capacity to make t-shirts, something that basic. You know, that there's a lot of demand out there for not the cheapest product anymore. Our ability to make the cloth is pretty much there, that capacity is there, but the ability to be able to respond with hundreds, thousands, or even tens of thousands of garments without years of lead time, in a way of working with manufacturers that is fair, compliant, and everything else, so that you can have all your checks and balances in place. Because we are small pockets of capability, it just become, you actually hold back from taking a product to market, not because there isn't a market for it, but because you know you would struggle to deliver in a time frame because of the sheer number of people required to scale up, which is a real shame. And again, I think one of the challenges is, and even just at the garment making stage, just because the product's soft doesn't mean it's easy to make. You know, it's actually quite difficult to sew jersey together without getting it all puckered, all messed up, or the neckline skewing off somewhere. And that's actually about 5 different machines involved, it's not just one. And so so there's a lot of perception that, you know, you could just give someone 3 months training and they'll be ready to work. And it's like, they might be ready to sort the labels. They might be ready to help lay up. They might be ready to do QC and folding. They might be ready to do some stages on some processes. But it actually is a really technical skill. But yeah, it's interesting, the perception of how quickly we could pivot people into where there are many jobs going.
Well, and look, the reality is, and the experience that I've had in recent times is that there isn't a lot of idle hands anywhere in Australia at the moment. We've relied heavily on imported labour for so long, and this industry particularly has relied on that migratory labour from the Asian areas, and you know, we haven't been able to encourage or enthuse young Australian-born people into this industry very easily.
But I do think, and you know, Leon, obviously we know each other from working and sharing our knowledge for the benefit of skills for this country. I do think some of it's also the structure around how people can access the skills training, though.
Yeah.
Because, and I think these chickens are coming home to roost in a lot of sectors right now where there are well-paying jobs, but not massively paying jobs in many sectors, and hospitality's feeling it really as well right now. Whereas you look at the debt burden that somebody needs to take on to do that training, but there's maybe a path to a rewarding job as part of a great team, as part of a great company, that's maybe potentially part of a really rewarding life in a community, but that's not the same as being on a trajectory to being a partner in a law firm, which means the incentive to take on a burden that's still tens of thousands of dollars of debt isn't there. You know, it's not the same as taking on that debt burden if you're doing training to be a plumber and one day you're going to be running your own little crew or something. So I think actually we can make the case that the work can be rewarding, and we've got, you know, there are some fantastic businesses that are doing a great job of, you know, making this industry not its perceived Victorian era anymore. But that pathway to being really of value to those employers is still a bit of a valley of death right now, and I think many sectors are seeing this, where the award, you know, or the fair wage, which isn't nothing, is still not that much considering the cost of the training. And we haven't seemed to have found a way to crack that nut, and I wonder if accessing some of that first stage training to get a taste of being part of an industry wasn't so prohibitive, maybe for some people looking for a change, looking for getting back to work after having children, looking for getting in, you know, just because they're looking for something different to do, for whatever reason and whatever time in their life, to make some of those first hurdles of getting those basic skills down to be not something that they're going to worry about paying for later.
It's a message that I've been trying to talk to the New South Wales government about for some time. Where, you know, this is a return on investment mentality. Unfortunately, they're very transactional in what they're willing to fund. They seem to want to fund a lot of, you know, hospitality. You know, people who are working in fast food, those sorts of things, who generally don't stay in that industry very long. And not to say it's not a value. I think it is a value. But I think there is, you know, not enough focus on people that I think are sovereign need. And I think there's a lot of the textile
sovereign
stuff
capabilities are a whole other risk factor, really, isn't it?
And particularly around defence. You know, you talk about defence and safety. These are really critical needs for us as Australians.
My little byline at the moment, you know, people worry about us being able to make a missile. We can't even make a pair of socks from scratch in this country. We can make socks. We can't make the yarn in this country that they're made from. We've got some very good sock manufacturers, I'll be clear on that. But to go from fibre all the way through without leaving the country, no, we can't do that. And I also think one of the challenges we have now when we talk about trying to do something about waste is our skills for mend and repair, because they cross over a lot. And again, textiles is one of them, but not the only one. But because actually that working really well involves people maybe repairing their own things. I mean, there is a lot of work in alterations. They are always screaming for skills as well. But actually, because we count the benefit in terms of paid wages and GDP, rather than, actually, if we've got this community really skilled, at times like this, when the crunch is on, they're going to be more capable of fixing a zip or fixing a hem or altering something, which means they're going to make their own money and their own belongings go further, or be able to help a friend out, or stop something going to landfill, or upcycling it for, you know, their own very local and immediate benefit. But because we can't quantify that, we then don't get behind that. And it's quite, you know, the circular economy is a big buzzword at the moment. In and of itself, it's not really a new thing, it's just a new term. But when you look at the diagram of the sort of hierarchy of things to do, number one is repair. And yet we're busy investing in the recycle right at the outside, which is the worst. You know, that's just the last before landfill or the downcycling. And there's a lot of energy involved in that, and logistics and sorting and all the rest of it. And it's like, well, this skill to keep things in its higher order is the thing we're least keen to invest in. So, but it's because we can see we've spent $5 million supporting this processing plant, and that's a nice story. And we need to do that too. Good God, the problem's huge. I wouldn't take away from that, but it is interesting that when it's not, okay, we need 400 workers here or we need 200 here, when basically it's not big and announceable, it's not interesting.
Yeah.
And yet having pockets of this capability laced throughout the country lifts everybody's capability and lifts our capacity in all sorts of ways. You know, we saw a lot of people come to the party at the beginning of COVID with making scrubs, making masks, all the rest of it. Good, bad and indifferent that some of that was. But a lot of people really enjoyed feeling valuable and feeling needed and feeling, you know, useful. And we will regret if we lose the skills to do it and the skills to maintain the machines that people use, which is another super niche.
Yeah, I know. I was involved in trying to reinvigorate the textile machine mechanic, and a lot of the textile machine mechanics that are out there are very elderly,
yes,
very experienced by
yes,
every example, but trying to enthuse someone to go and work in the textiles industry as a machine mechanic is not all that attractive.
Yeah, or then incentivising said experienced textile mechanics to be prepared to take someone under their wing as well. You know, and that's not an easy thing to do, and it doesn't suit everyone. But yes, we have a lot of capability, but it's very fragile. You know, I even actually heard on the news this morning somebody talking about one newsprint mill left in Tasmania.
Yeah.
You know, and so I think it's a really interesting time, but we seem to need to have to let the wheels fall off before we'll put them back on again.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really matter how many experienced people say, you'll regret losing that capability. Yeah. You know, and it is quite interesting when, my bit of phrase at the moment with sovereign capabilities, we do seem to be rather interested in our sovereign capability to kill, but not very interested in our sovereign capability to care.
Yeah.
And yet actually, when we look at some of the challenges that we're facing right now, or you look at what would have been on the list of first essentials into Lismore or first essentials into any post-cyclone zone, included in there are things that are textile products.
Yeah.
Included in there are things for health and hygiene and medical products. You know, some of them might be single use, they might just be a band-aid, they might be a mask, but all of these things are actually part of the textile industry.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't take much to switch a lot of that back on, but we do have to decide to do it.
Yeah.
And if we wait another even 5 years, a lot of the knowledge that we do still have really will be getting a bit longer.
Yeah, I really think that we need to look at our hierarchy of needs.
Yes.
And understand what that means, and why we should be investing in these things. There's been a bit of an open door policy. We've been the only ones playing free trade in the world in a lot of cases, instead of fair trade. And you know, we've been, you know, and the textiles industry is a good example of this, where they've outsourced a lot of their labour off to the third world, and we've seen the Bangladesh disasters and things like that. I'd much rather, and I feel much happier, paying a bit more for an Australian-made product, knowing that worker is being looked after and they actually have skills that are, you know, useful to us as a nation.
Yeah, and I think actually there's a lot of myth busting to be done as well. And you know, for a lot of the stages of processing, yes, the garment making is labour intensive, but a lot of the other stages actually aren't, which means really it's a matter of real estate, it's a matter of insurance, and it's a matter of the price of power. Well, we're dealing with power. I mean, there's so much going on now that factories will basically be able to power themselves. You know, we can be in precincts with renewable energy, you know, that, you know, is already underway, you know, and in a way we've got these strategies to talk about transitioning to renewable energy, and it's like, well, okay, that's great. What are we going to do with it? What are we going to make with it? What products are the products of the future that are still going to be sustainable in 20 years' time? Well, it's going to be the products that can either be part of our biological system, either started off, we grew them, we milled them, and then at the end of life we can compost them, or products that we can properly, completely collect back. In textiles, that's a challenge with synthetics. You can't, there is no real sustainable synthetic washed textiles, they shed. But But then when we look at that and you go, well, okay, so actually we've got this myth going on that wages are the handbrake on manufacturing. The only reason wages are the price they are is because of the rent and mortgages that everybody's got to pay.
Yeah.
And the only, one of the massive overheads on an industry is rent on a building, insurance on a building, all of those overheads that go with being in a commercial building, because we rightly have, systems and processes in place that work environments are safe. We have a lot of, so all of that, but really at the end of the day, that isn't actually necessarily that we need a cast of thousands. I mean, all of the stages through to cloth, yes, people are involved, but not incredibly so. And the latest technology, sensor systems, robotics, and all the rest of it means, yes, it's a technical workforce, just like many other of the examples in other areas of manufacturing where things are changing, elements have been innovated, it gets called advanced. It's no different, really. It's no different. And so it is a shame that there's often this, there's some things we're never going to be able to do here. But they're often said by people who may or may not know anything about the industry they're talking about, and B, they're making assumptions that are at least 20 years old.
Yeah.
And I think we really do ourselves a detriment by not taking another look under the bonnet of some of the opportunities in front of us. Like now, and I remember, God, I feel like ancient. When I was at university 3 million years ago, the whole garment knitting machines were already in existence. Essentially push the button and go. Well, people are using, the price of them probably hasn't changed in the 20 years, which makes them a lot more competitive now. And so there are some elements of garments that literally can be, apart from a few loose ends tying up and knowing how to ask it to do what you want, you can actually have a garment that doesn't need any sewing made to fit a person. Well, that's a whole different ball game. The funny thing is, the very same technology of that is the same technology that you would learning to knit socks. Imagine me telling you, right, I'd like to start training everybody in sock manufacture. It's a really difficult line to sell, but that same technology is in the Nike Flyknit runners, where they've gone from cutting pieces out of fabric to knitting just the panel size they want to reduce the waste. That's the same technology in whole garments. So and I've actually accidentally landed there, really is on this perception that old industries aren't worth learning about, understanding, or investing in training because, well, they're old, why would we need to do that? But actually the fundamentals of the engineering from whenever haven't really changed. They've just been applied with new technology, and you actually need to understand those fundamentals first before you can then add the tech on top of it. So you need to understand the fundamentals of how machine knitting works and then the fundamentals of how a garment fits before you can program the machine that's going to automatically do it and select the right yarn and select the right gauges, etc. So you still got to learn in a very sort of analog fashion, and then we overlay the tech on top of it to make it work hard, so we don't need a cast of thousands. That's really complex. That's not a 2-year course. It's probably 4 to 6 years of training, really, to be competent in that. And we seem to struggle with this business of excellence and mastery. We don't, certainly there's nowhere to get a qualification in being a sort of master tailor. No. Like, you just got to be lucky enough to find someone to learn from.
Well, even the concept of finish your traineeship or your apprenticeship, that only makes you competent to practice your occupation. Mastery usually comes maybe 10 years, depending on who you're employed by.
It's like training a surgeon.
You look at your own career and you've mastered a lot of skills because you've had a very diverse career. If you stayed in one place and only did one thing your whole career, mastery would have come a lot later.
Yes.
and may never be achieved.
Yeah.
But just, I wanted to take you back briefly about, I know in Sydney, I've visited a number of places where they used to tan leather.
Yes.
And you can't get a leather tannery or even a wool wash approved these days due to EPA restrictions. The chemicals that were used in some of those processes have created policies, and policies that have sort of stuck, and the old mentality remains, but there are new technologies, aren't there?
Yeah, I won't say that leather's my strong suit, although I am a big fan of Packer Leather, who are on the north side of Brisbane here, and to my knowledge, from whenever I do catch up with them, they are at the forefront of working with whatever the latest chemicals and finishing techniques are. I think they've got 7 hectares of treatment ponds for their the water, the what comes off and everything. But I do know that one of the challenges for small manufacturers that may want to play with latest technology as far as chemical finishing goes is if a chemical hasn't been approved for safety here. So if you want to try and play with an innovative new chemical that's been invented by one of the global chemical companies, because you know they're not all evil wizards, these chemists, you know, they're actually good people trying to make things safer for the world. I'm afraid this is a few years old, I don't know if it's still the case, but if something was, say, considered safe in the EU, you might still need to spend thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars on approvals to bring in even one small tin. I mean, one small tin can be full of some dangerous stuff, but to bring in just one small tin to run a test, to even see if it's going to suit your process.
Yeah.
Which means, again, these are some of the challenges of critical mass. So we've got niche producers and niche processors that may be the only ones in the country that do their thing. The opportunity to innovate means they probably need to collaborate, you know, with international companies. But then it might be that they've got something that would meet the EPA guidelines, but to bring in that new thing involves some other different red tape. And they're thinking, well, I don't know if that's the chemical I actually want to play with, because I want to try a couple of different ones because they're getting amended and updated all the time. So that might feed into that challenge.
Yeah.
But there are interesting challenges with some of our, you know, and I'm passionate about trying to be as efficient and careful as possible with our resources. But I know of an amazing business in the UK called Regenex that's actually rescuing lots of hospitality linens and chef's gear, etc., that would normally be condemned in the normal commercial laundry sector, where they can't get the stains out. And in the UK there are very strict litres per kilo limits for the EPA regs on the processing. But because they're skilled dyers, they're skilled in how to get colour out, and they're also, their chemistry handling capability and permission is at a whole different level. So they actually now have a completely separate lines set up to salvage stuff that would have gone to landfill, but they can get the stains out that the normal industrial laundries can't. And so they're extending life of 30-40% longer. And if you think of a water footprint saving of a cotton chef's jacket not getting thrown out, so even though the process itself might be a little bit more onerous than a normal industrial wash, it's done in somewhere with all the safety and everything of handling of some of those more difficult chemical processes, but they're able to salvage that, which saves thousands of litres of footprint compared with the new product. So, you know, there's some of these, it is often difficult, and it's often difficult when our regulators probably don't know our industry at all.
Yeah.
You know, I think there's probably the only textile scientists or engineers employed at any level of government in this country, I think, work for defence. And yet we procure and use so many textiles nationwide, every level of government, and it gets bought like they buy A4 paper.
Yeah.
You know, or it's just a list of a spec and a tick box, meet that standard, okay. And the next time somebody's buying it, it's a different person buying it. So and the same probably, you know, relatively speaking, it's not an industry that's as big as some others that would have people at EPA that maybe become specialists in dealing with some processing sectors, maybe like meatworks and things like that.
Yeah, I think there's larger chemical industries that probably get more focused than what ours does, and trying to educate someone, it takes a long time, because this is like playing 4D chess, this textiles industry. My experience when I first started having anything with it, well, it was sort of funny because my father was, he came from the UK as well, and he was a fiberglasser. So composites was a new thing in the world in the 50s, and he came here in the late 60s, early 70s. So I grew up with him involved in that, and then I joined an aircraft company, and my specialisation was composites.
Right.
So that's when I learned about warp and weft, and you talked about draping and things earlier. and understanding how these fabrics behave,
Yes.
And different weaves and different materials will perform in different ways.
Yeah.
So it's quite amazing
Yes.
how we use these things, and we even use them in structures now.
Yes.
You know, for buildings, carpets. You know, quite often I'm trying to explain to young kids at school about, you know, what manufacturing is. Everything around us is manufactured.
Yes.
To think that it all comes in a box from another country, I think is purely fantasy.
Yes.
And we need to sort of open people's eyes up a bit and get them to understand it.
And I think, and that's actually one of the challenges of, because so many things have become so cheap, it's hard to believe there's so much complexity behind it.
Yeah.
And, you know, we're wrestling with this rampant waste of stuff every year. The global textile industry now is using 110 million tonnes of new fibre every year. 90% of that is burned or going to landfill every year, pro rata in the system, which is an extortionate amount of waste. About 8% gets downcycled into something, and about 1% gets properly recycled. 60% of that is oil-based, i.e. polyester, or the other synthetics. The use of natural fibre hasn't really changed volumetrically over 20 years. The proportion of global textile use natural fibres dropped, but that's because synthetics just grown and grown and grown, because that's where all the capacity is and that's where all the cheap is. But I think that then gives us this challenge of, well, oh my God, we just got it from the dollar shop, or we just pick it up. Oh, well, it was so cheap. You know, people walking away from a festival having bought a tent as a single-use tent.
Yeah.
How did we get there? You know, and that's a whole load of things. You've got, you know, you've got the fabric, you've got the thread, you've got the poles, you've got the base. There's probably 4 or 5 different polymers there that, you know, one use. Wow. And
the reality of this, I think, is not just the fact that it is wasteful of a material, but it's wasteful of a human resource.
Yeah.
You know, the cost it takes to manufacture something, whether it be here or somewhere else, we're using time to manufacture something that is going to go into landfill.
Like, you know, it takes the same amount of time to sew the armhole on the shirt, whether the fabric's going to fall apart in 5 washes or 500 washes.
Yeah.
You know, and this, you actually bring me to how important design is, because everybody treats the design in our sector like it's the flimsy thing. You know, oh, designers, and you're like, well, you know, there's design and design, but technically designing a product so that it fits someone really well, so that it doesn't pull, it doesn't gape, it's easier to wear, and workwear even more so, really. But generally, almost everybody can think of some garments in their wardrobe at home that they love. They love the way it fits. They wish they could find another one. They wish they'd bought 2 at the time. Something happened that day, it came together. And the garment engineering, the design and making sure that garment fits, being able to grade those garments so that they fit on people of different sizes, has the biggest impact on waste. Because I could sell you the most amazing sustainable fabric, but if somebody puts it into a t-shirt that's got a funny neckline, or the waist's a bit wrong, or this, that and the other, it doesn't really matter how amazing the fabric is. You might wear it a couple of times, kind of go, oh, I wish I liked it more, it's got this good story, but it'll end up in the op shop bin. You might buy something else that's got no provenance whatsoever, but oh my God, it fits you and you feel fantastic. And this isn't just women, this is men. You know, when you put on that great suit jacket and you stand taller, your shoulders are back, you feel good, you're ready for the day. You look after that garment. You take more care. You, whether it's just in the laundry, you take a bit more care that, you know, any zips are closed in there, or you've put it in a laundry bag or something, which means you're extending the life of that product because it's designed so well that you want to look after it. And that's actually, particularly in garments, when people struggle, oh, I was training all these designers. I think we could do a lot more in making sure we train people to be able to design and make a pattern so a garment fits, as opposed to, I want it to look like that, can somebody else do the technical work? The technical business of designing apparel to fit really well for purpose is an actual critical factor in the sustainability part of our industry, because an awful lot of garments that are discarded quickly are discarded because they don't really fit anyone. And one of the biggest impacts at the moment now with online is the returns and the carbon footprint of the returns. And then it's so cheap that it's not worth repackaging it to sell again, which means it goes straight to the bin. Wow. You know.
Well, I know when I first started here, and I was working with a colleague of yours, Paula Rogers.
Yes.
And she took me around to some of the faster fashion houses. It was astounding to me how much stuff didn't even hit a shelf and went into the bin because the fashion wasn't selling, so it ended up in a bin. So yeah, I 100% agree with you, and trying to find designers that are not just looking at what something looks like, but how it performs. You know, I'm a big fan of merino wool, for instance. You know, behind you I've got a jacket from R.M. Williams, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
I like that brand. I like the designs and the thoughtfulness that goes into something that's meant to last. You know, I can have my boots resoled.
Yes.
That's the way I think clothing's meant to be.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, because of consumerism and we want more of something instead of higher quality of something, this is sort of driving this market.
Well, we kind of got too efficient, really. You know, one of the reasons I started in this industry is because I just loved making things, and I still do. So I can still hand knit, and I can actually hand spin. And it's only really in the last 250 years that women haven't been responsible for hand spinning the yarn of everything their family makes, unless somebody's so rich they're paying someone to spin. The business of mechanical spinning is so relatively young in the history of our existence. And the ability to hand spin well was the source of wealth for families. You know, whatever their local crop was, whether it was flax, whether it was silk, whether it was wool or cotton, whatever. And so, you know, the wealth and poverty of nations struck on their ability to clothe and protect their people. You know, how many sails can be made over a winter for sailing again? You know, and that was literally that hand business, which meant, you know, a fine silk dress could cost the same as a ship. Right. And you know, there were wars over lace 400 years ago. But we've got so good at mechanising it. We've got so good at making it quickly that we can afford to not pay attention to what's involved, which is a real shame. And I think, you know, people probably have similar echoes in maybe some of the way our food gets to market now, and that's become so processed rather than, you know, and yet so much food gets away. So I think the challenges we face in the textile and clothing sector are echoed in different places, but particularly because it's become so out of sight, out of mind with the supply chain, that we've just started taking it, you know, oh my God, I've got to spend more than $5 on a t-shirt. Oh, coffee was $6.
Yeah.
Like, how did that become our normal? But the idea now, and I say this as a parent too, that it's going to be at least $25, $30, $40 or $50 for a t-shirt for a growing child.
Yeah.
Our budgets are all arranged around it not costing that much.
Yeah.
Our livelihood budgets are arranged around all of our money going on housing, you know, and then possibly tech and possibly comms, and the idea that we need to spend that much on our stuff. Whereas, you know, and you think, oh, grouch going, well, I remember my grandma talking about the one coat that she had for 40 years. But that time, you know, that the money that would have been involved in that investment, because that's what it would have been, okay, well, I want this thing to be the best it can be for me because I'm buying this once.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, it's incredible.
But I also think that it wouldn't take much to switch a lot of this back on.
Yeah, I hear, and I was at an event in Sydney yesterday with Roy Green. I don't know if you know who Roy Green is.
Yeah, I do know who he is. I'd like to meet him.
He was speaking about, you know, a lot of our capability that we've lost will never come back, and I don't necessarily agree with that mentality. it takes will, and it takes will by the people who are leading this nation, as well as our states and our local communities and us as consumers, to will that into being. We're at the point of an election at the moment. The things that they are talking about, cost of living. Cost of living is addressed fairly easily by less consumerism and less, inflation due to other things. So I think we just need to collectively, and it's easy because we say these things as soon as they drop out of our mouths, they go. And I know due to COVID, everybody's saying there's going to be a resurgence in manufacturing and we're going to have all this stuff going on. We can't find people.
Yes, that's the biggest challenge. I think the will's there. I know how many cold contacts my own business has had over COVID because they want to support Australian. And that's nice. But I mainly sell fabric, so they've gone, okay, I will get fabric from you. And I can tell they've gone and hit the wall of where the hell am I going to get a sample made? Wherever, people, all over the country. Or the fact that it is just so expensive to do it. And it's not that it's expensive in itself, it's just the market it has to compete in means it's expensive. And but I'm sure most of it's actually the access in and of itself to the skills and capacity of those skills to there is a lot of demand for local, and there are so many people, very clever people, that could easily optimize your website, your search engine optimization, all the rest of it to get the traction. The question is, how much can you actually deliver in a time frame? And that's really the big challenge at the moment. That is the handbrake on reshoring here.
So can you tell us a little bit about your business? And you're talking about your t-shirt and your difficulty in getting people to manufacture for you.
So I'm fortunate that from my years, obviously I've got some relationships with local manufacturers here, and I can organise to get t-shirts made and things like that. But my main business is actually I work with one cotton grower in St George, Australian super cotton, and it was just absolute serendipity that we were introduced maybe 6 years ago now. Glenn is passionate about the quality of the fibre that he grows, and they're farming with the next generations in mind. And he had wanted to get his fibre into products, and at that same time I'd had this whole paddock to plate's kind of getting big. I would like to be able to do the same thing with paddock to product. Let's do it for cotton. There's people already doing it for wool. And with that, particularly thinking of the handcraft space, actually, because it's something that I understand, and it's a space where people do take great care of what goes into the products they choose to make. And discovered that you couldn't buy an Australian cotton grown handcraft yarn for crochet or anything. But obviously the reason these things aren't there is because it's not easy.
So what is that? What is a yarn?
What is a yarn? Okay, so this is a yarn.
You've got these things on the table.
So here's my yarn. So there's a yarn. So cotton grows on a plant, and it's pretty amazing. That's just pure cellulose. It's the purest form of cellulose that grows. That's why it's still the base stock for US money. From there, you could actually hand spin that, and you could put that against your skin and wear it. But we don't do that with gin it. We pick it with machines, not people.
For people that are listening, you think of a cotton wool, so it's on the end of a stem. The cotton wool or cotton ball that you'd get in a bag that you buy from a chemist. It looks very similar.
So there's the cotton. I'm going to leave that on there because that's really pretty. So the cotton gets picked off, and then in there are these great big seeds. And this is what gets taken out of the cotton gin. So those seeds are taken out of the cotton gin. That's the first mechanical process. And they are actually packed with amazing goodness. They are used either as a cattle feed or they are crushed for cottonseed oil. They are not a waste product. So number one, myth bust. And also they're not frankenseeds. So when they are managed and taken back, that would regrow into cotton. A lot of myths there. No, it would regrow. And then the ginned cotton has to be turned into something that we can make a cloth from, because there's quite a few stretches from there. So the ginned cotton has to be spun. This is the bit we can't do in Australia anymore at scale.
So at the moment we are growing some cotton.
We grow a lot of cotton.
Yeah, along the New South Wales Queensland border, and there's some down in Griffith now.
Yeah, so actually cotton's growing everywhere from Emerald down to northern Victoria and also up in the NT and some parts of northern Queensland.
The agronomy's improved a lot, hasn't it? So
it's changed out of sight in the last 20 years. So it's my understanding that 20 years ago the cotton industry wasn't so efficient, used a lot of water, and they did use a lot of chemicals. Now we are the global leaders for being efficient and careful with our resources and the land that it grows on. So the water usage has gone down over 40% and the chemical usage has gone down over 90% in the last 20 years. So Australian cotton truly is the lowest impact cotton grown in the world. If the whole world grew cotton the way we did, we'd only need 25% of the land and water. Now, no doubt there are people listening to this that are probably jumping up and down about water, etc. The way we manage irrigation licenses, which is patchy and difficult, is a whole different conversation around the volume of water we allow for irrigation. And that matters whether it's cotton, whether it's walnuts, whether it's almonds, whether it's rice, whether it's grain. That is a question for a farmer of what they do with their license. But what I can say from the cotton growers I know is they deeply care about the land that they work with and on, and the family growers that are there for the long haul and farming with their grandchildren in mind are not looking to just extract everything out of the system in 1 year and then leave nothing for the next, not at all. It's also interesting with our opportunities as a nation of great floods some years and others, not to kind of liken it a bit to Joseph and his 7 years of famine and his 7 years of feast, because at the moment we have had a lot of rain. Cotton and other annual crops like grains, etc., we plant them when we've got water, and when in the years when we didn't have much water we didn't plant much. So these are actually a source of income that fits with our changing nature of climate. So this year, unbelievably, at the end of the season, everybody's water storages are still full because there's been so much rain, which means they know what they can plan for next year. But once it's picked, that's dry and that's baled. And so 99.9% of what Australia grows goes offshore and gets blended in overseas supply chains. And that cotton bale is what you would see the cotton bale price for if you were watching Landline. And it is currently absolutely astronomical because of pressures on crops in other countries right now. So that's... And
again, for people who are listening, what Mira's got in her hands looks like a stuffing out of a pillow or out of a quilt, but usually those things are a cellulose or a polyester.
Yeah. Whereas this is actually natural cotton. The only time the common thing this is actually a stuffing for is traditionally is things like futons. So this gets spun into yarn, and then with the yarn, and this is a bit of a chunky one, this is yarn. So this is the ingredient then at different scales and thicknesses.
It's like a string.
Looks like a string, or looks like a thread, but it gets called yarn when it's going to be made into cloth as opposed to a thread that's going to be used to sew it together. The textile industry is full of words that have just been the case forever because it's an old industry and you just kind of get used to it really. It's no other way around it. And so this yarn could be made to then be the yarn that's made into this t-shirt fabric, which actually goes into a circular knitting machine, or they can be laid up and woven to make, for example, your jeans or something like that. And so then you've got the cloth. But this business of yarn that's also just used for, not just used, but used by people that maybe crochet or knit or things like that, that's actually a really, it's quite a massive market as well, actually. And people, love to crochet something for new baby coming along, things like that. So yeah, they like to know where their fiber's from. So that's sort of where that grew from. And I wanted to make it possible for small and medium designers to be able to access an Australian grown, Australian made cotton fabric, because there was nowhere else to get one from, which was ridiculous. And so I work with
It takes a brick to come to Australia to do that.
The funny thing with this country, I meet so many people who aren't originally from this country that go, oh my God, we could do this, this and this is amazing. And I guess, I don't know, when there's just sort of all this opportunity just laid out there. Wow, we've got this space, we've got this, we've got that, let's go. But I guess, it's challenging in countries which have had the almost good fortune and misfortune to have a lot of raw material in the ground that have made it not so essential to value add.
Yeah.
It's a blessing and a curse.
Yeah.
So that's what that is, and therefore, and I just thought, well, if I'm the only person with this, I want to make it available to people, whether they just want to buy a couple of meters of fabric because they want to make something for themselves, or somebody that wants to buy a batch of fabric for their small batches or medium batches as a designer. So yeah, that's what I do, and then with that I also collaborate on some other technical projects and things like that. And
so your main game is to go from paddock to a flat piece of material.
Piece of fabric, yep. A flat piece of fabric that then somebody can choose to put into their own t-shirt shape, or I've got a custom makes underwear, and all sorts of things. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so what would you say, and these are sort of those finishing sort of questions I'm going to ask you now, what's the thing that gets you out of bed in the morning?
We just have to do this differently.
Yeah.
Like I can't stand waste, and I can see that we could bring back the spinning, and we could bring the making viscose here as well, which is regenerated cellulose. That could be a whole other hour conversation. I love being involved in making a great product. I love working with fantastic people, like my farmer, like the mills that I work with, and I love being part of being able to maybe change a system in my small way that I've begun. And yeah, that's kind of it really. I'm fortunate that I work with a product that I love, and I love sharing that knowledge with my customers too as they go on their journey developing products.
Awesome. And for someone who might be looking at a career in textiles, what would you say?
Oh, if you're still at school, take chemistry, take maths, take the hardest science you can handle. Any sustainability. People want to be in the circular economy, but they're not interested in what it's made of. They're just cheerleaders. If you want to be on the field, you're going to need to do the science. And then for textile science, this is a tricky one because we don't have our bachelor's degree in textile science available anymore. That was at RMIT. So I would say the actual fabric side, maybe you need to go and do process engineering and then maybe study overseas or try and do a master's. Places overseas still have the textile science degrees, but it's only a handful. Hong Kong, I think, and RMIT does a course in Sri Lanka. And then obviously UK, Europe, places like that. For garments, oh my gosh, go to TAFE first. Yeah. Learn to make a garment. Learn to cut a pattern.
What about the girls that have got their focus on fashion purely and not the rest of it?
Well...
Or guys, for that matter?
I'd say if you want to be able to set yourself apart from your peers, you're going to need to understand your product. I spent some time teaching at TAFE, and I was asked constantly about what was the most sustainable fabrics, which was great because that meant everybody was interested. But people struggle to understand it all because it's actually really quite deeply technical, and people often want just a sound bite. And what I would say is that if you make sure you've got that technical capability, even if it's not what you do once you've finished studying, if you understand how a garment goes together, if you did it while you were studying, if you had to put it together yourself, you're going to be able to have those conversations with your garment graders, your technicians, your sample makers, your factories. You'll be able to talk to them and manage your product in a way that you can't do it if you don't know that yourself. And it also means your ability to play, innovate, and all the rest of it will be on steroids compared with people that don't understand, because you go, okay, that hasn't worked, but this might work instead. And you can have a really collaborative, innovative relationship with the technical people in your supply chain if you've got as deep an understanding as you can get. Whereas if you're just going, oh, here's a scribble, I want it to look like this, you're at the mercy of them saying what's possible or not, and then you've got no leg to stand on to challenge them to go, oh, how could we try this as well? Which is actually where a lot of product innovation comes from. So I would say actually just to develop the understanding of the base, even if you don't imagine yourself at a sewing machine for your whole life, understanding what it takes to do that will give you an edge.
Awesome. And just finally, social media. Do you have social media? A
little bit. I'm on Instagram, Full Circle Fibres, and I'm on Twitter, which is Full Circle Fibre.
And if anyone wanted to contact you, are you happy for me to include your email address?
Yes, absolutely. My website's in rebuild at the moment, so by the time this publishes, maybe that will be the case. So
awesome.
That's
okay. Meriel, Chamberlin, thank you very much for being on Manufacturing Conversations with Leon Drury.
Thank you, Leon. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.